All right, I think it's useful to leave tobacco and the companies with a little bit of intense scrutiny, which is available to many of you who do research and find the library out in California to be useful. Some of you may not be aware of what happened, but the library has a complete report, a listing of reports and some items. And from time to time, I find it useful since I was apparently very helpful in arranging some initial efforts which are available. I can go back and in some cases I can even find some of the things that were inspirational to me. One particular idea was to expose the industry to some of its most embarrassing and terrible behaviors. And that, to me, was excruciatingly important when I left, not because of anger or for distancing myself from them in any way, but because I could. And because it was necessary. And I think the important thing is to find embarrassing things and to expose them for what they are. For example, in the case of coumarin as a diabolical content in pipe tobacco, I gave that information to Dickie Scruggs, and Dickie Scruggs gave that information to Jeffrey Wigand, and Jeffrey Wigand was able to testify. I believe he may have testified to the effect that coumarin was a rat poison, or maybe it was something else. But what interests me today is to continue to, well, expose the tobacco industry where some of it seems to be, to me, left alone. Now, I came across a document in the very middle of my stay at Brown and Williamson many years ago, and the document was part of not a prepared document to be analyzed by anyone except the first stage. And perhaps it didn't reach the second stage, but it was a document from British American Tobacco, and it was sent to the scientists at Brown and Williamson at a time when the scientists were actually doing some kind of work in the 60s, and particularly with reference to a kind of tobacco that came about, which was called Blackfat. Now, this is something that actually appears in the documents in California, at least the reference. And I just happened to come across, I wanted to make sure that I had the term right, but it shocked me that British American Tobacco was interested in determining what this form of a disease that had been caused by a particular kind of tobacco called blackfat tobacco. Now, the disease was related to a pulmonary fibrosis, and it killed people. And well, it wasn't funny to those who were in Guyana, and particularly the mold that it produced was an aspergillus type mold, a fungus, which was apparently being used and smoked. And there were many, many ways that this could be useful to where I was. and where I was reading documents, and particularly for RD&E, which was research, development, and engineering, which also was the place where, in the 60s at least, there was an effort to field documents, to look at documents, and wherever they came into a context of something that might be discoverable by lawyers, that in those days they were actually worried about lawsuits. They were concerned about lawsuits. They were concerned about lawyers and what was going to happen. And so, what was a reality in terms of what people were doing and not doing, to the extent that it affected ongoing litigation. I mean, who would have ever thought it? And who in Sierra Leone or in Guyana, British Guyana, would ever have filed a lawsuit against them? I don't know. But one of the things that's always intrigued me about this particular, I remember, document was the fact that there was such coldness, such a diabolical coldness between the British scientists who was looking at the deaths and the people who were killed as a result of this Blackfat tobacco. Now, this was something that came about in, I think, the 19th century, when a ship was wrecked and it had tobacco and it got oil on it, and the natives began to use it. Now, that's my recollection of Blackfat. And while it was tainted originally, and they found that the natives happened to like it, and it appeared in places such as in Africa and in Trinidad and Tobago and Trinidad, the West Indian reference. It became very popular. But what was not so popular was the way in which, at least at one time, the characterization of a human resource, I mean a project, a paper that was submitted by BAT to Brown and Williamson for inspection, because the document itself was doing research on why these people in Guyana were dying, and they were using this Blackfat tobacco. And so curiosity got the best of these people in British American tobacco, and I've always observed how candid they were and how interested they were in trying to find out. Well, if something's wrong, and this was in the late 60s, I believe, and I'm going on memory solely, but I was struck by the fact that the concept was, well, if you want to find out why these natives in this area, and I think it was British Guiana particularly, were dying like flies. They were just getting too much of the aspergillus, which is a fungus which goes into the lungs, and when you smoke it, and it kills you. You know, there's a pulmonary problem here. It could be useful to a plaintiff's lawyer back in the 1960s, but not likely, because nobody suspected that I would ever come along and divulge some of this information. And who would ever suspect that people like Dickie Scruggs and Don Barrett and Ron Motley would come along and with the inspirational thought of the Lewises and the Medicaid lawsuits, devise a theory whereby they could actually settle something that had killed people over the years in many different ways, and get off scot-free, practically. Uh, and today, as we look at the wonderful attributions of the American legacy, you just have to admit that these people have either made a deal with the devil, or you read what they're doing. It's pure. It's like fairy tales, and let me tell you some more. It's like they're not interested in embarrassing them. They're not able to embarrass them because they made a deal. Money for oblivious. Uh, don't taint me. Don't try to make me look bad or whatever. But I'm going to make you look bad. So here's my point. Now, there was one document that just was like a few others, but it's strikingly important and familiar to me how morally bankrupt the people in the study of tobacco would receive information, and they would receive the autopsy or the reports. Then they would investigate it. And this particular case, I remember a document, long and full of technicality, but basically boiling down to the fact that if you were using Blackfat tobacco, which had a history, particularly in some islands in Guyana and in Tobago and places like Sierra Leone, the killing field that they had observed was maintained by and through a particular form of contaminated tobacco. Now, since it began as an accident in a shipwreck and people picking this tobacco out of the ocean and then drying and using it years and years ago, it became a treat of something that people were used to smoking. But at some point, there was a commercialization of it because it was so popular, and so trying to replicate it and engineer it so that it could be appealing was important. Well, the problem was there was not only a pulmonary disease that was being manifest in the product itself, but there were variations, and over the years, some of these variations in the middle part of the 20th century became significant to the scientists at BAT. That's British American Tobacco. And while they were looking at it and being so candid with the representation, which they found to be killing some of the people who were smoking this, they actually wanted to do a study. So somehow they probably marched down the aisles of Southampton and said, we've really got to look into this, old chap. We've got to find out whether or not our own staff is killing them, or maybe they're killing them from some other place. We need to know, just out of the matter of curiosity, somewhat like the British forming lines in a coliseum during the freedom of India, when the Indian nation wanted to be free. They wanted to shoot them down with machine guns, but it wasn't very easy to do. I mean, the British sometimes can be cold and cruel. In this case, they were cold and cruel because they found out that in the documentation, the actual truth was the tobacco was coming from Louisville, Kentucky. So they quickly wrote out a little note and they sent it over to Louisville, Kentucky, where the I.W. Hughes Center got it, and they read it and said, hey, it's your burley, it's your tobacco, and it's causing aspergillosis, and it's causing these deaths. What are we going to do? Well, the story actually ends there. I don't know what they did. But the people continue, and this continues to be a mystery. However, that's kind of like the moral scope of what you endure when you sell a lethal product. You can make it more lethal, and you can die younger, and you can die quicker. Just make it a different kind of tobacco. Now, I don't know what they did with it. I don't know if they ever changed it. But tobacco by itself is deadly enough, and so they wanted to make sure that they knew why this particular kind of Blackfat tobacco was killing people in Guyana, and so they found out it was being killed, produced as a killing agent from Louisville, Kentucky's Burley, or at least the headquarters. Remember, this is in the 60s. And of course, whenever I get a chance, and you're not going to do it, I'm going to make an opportunity to pull out what I can and embarrass. If that's going to be an embarrassment, I just don't know. Maybe they won't be embarrassed, but anyway, that's Blackfat tobacco and the killing fields. One more note, and the history of my experience with the Brown and Williamson and the British American Tobacco. Look at their own occupation, how to control the substance, and that's what they did. I don't know if they ever did anything about it or not, but it's interesting, and it remains so, and there's a few documents out there where you can read about it. Thank you.